Hi guys, this is Jim with Performance Technologies. Another update to our 300ZX project. This time we'll be installing piston rings on the pistons and then inserting the pistons and rods into the block, completing the short block assembly. So sit back and follow along. You're going to have 3 different sets of rings for each piston. You'll have a top ring, a second ring, and the oil retention rings. The first and second rings are hard to tell apart. So leave them in the bag or the boxes that they come in and do them one at a time. The oil rings they're a lot easier to tell apart. They're completely different than the other 2. They're also marked with the top of the ring, either with a dot or a triangle or some writing or something like that. That side goes up. So I'm doing the top ring here. We're just going to check the in clearance after the ring is inserted into the bore. If you've been watching, I did this one the hard way. It's the way most people start out trying to do it, and it's the hard way. The second ring, I'll show you the easy way to get it into the cylinder and centered. I'm using one of the new pistons to make sure that the ring is flat in the bore, and I like to do this with the ring about 1.5 inches to 2 inches down in the bore. This block has just been bored 20 over, so it really doesn't matter where in the cylinder you're going to check the clearances, but it's just a habit of mine, and it's a good habit to get into. Cylinder bores taper. On a worn block, you'll have a cylinder ridge, and under that ridge, the cylinder will taper from larger to smaller towards the bottom of the bore. You just use a set of feeler gauges. Your factory service manual will tell you the ring-in gaps. Factory is somewhere between 12 and 17 thousandths, but this is a turbo motor, of course, and we're planning to run more boost, so I'm going to widen that gap so we don't get the rings fracturing under heat. These will be gapped at around 20 to 22 thousandths on the top ring and the second ring. Just remember to keep these separate. Keep the top rings in their own bag or box, and keep the second rings in their own bag and box, and do them one at a time. And while you're doing this clearancing, just put them back in the where they came from before you move on to the next one. Everything looked fine with that. We're going to the second ring now. This is a much easier way to insert the ring. You're still going to use the top of one of the new pistons to push it down the board, make sure that it gets nice and centered and the ring is nice and flat so that you can check the in clearances. It's a fast and easy way to get this done. Again, it's about 1.5 inches, 2 inches down in the cylinder bore. You're just going to use the feeler gauges and set them to the clearance you want. Start there and go up or down and see what it actually is. This one's about 24 thousandths, which is fine for what we're doing on the second ring. First ring was right at 20 thousandths, and all 6 of them are going to be that way because the cylinders are all bored the same. Now we're moving on to the oil rings. They're completely different looking. Each ring has 3 pieces. There's an upper and a lower scraper ring, and then there's a separator ring that's an expandable, kind of an accordion looking style ring. All these rings do is control the oil to the cylinders. Now, cylinders have to have some oil to them, of course, or they're going to burn everything up. These are to control the oil getting to the combustion chambers. First and second rings are more for compression. These are for oil control. The expander just does what it sounds like. It expands, goes into the bottom ring groove. It's the widest ring groove. And on these particular NPR rings, there's a wire that runs through it, so it sort of expands on that wire, but it's just to keep it from getting away from you. The upper and lower scraper rings are identical. There is no top or bottom to them. It doesn't matter where you put where, they're the same. So we always start on the bottom of that ring groove and roll the ring on. You want to be very careful while we're doing this not to scratch the piston up. Any scratches, any sharp edges are going to retain heat, and we don't want any scratches. That's the bottom scraper. The top scraper is the same way. You put the end on top of that expansion ring and then roll it around, making sure when you pull that ring over to get it into the slot, make sure you don't drag it down the side of the piston and scratch up that piston. Just takes a little bit of time and a little bit of practice. Now we've got the oil retention rings assembled on this piston. We'll do the second ring next. You always want to start from the bottom ring groove and work your way up. Do the oil rings first, then the second ring, and then the top ring. And we're just going to roll them on. I'm doing this because I don't want to show you a bunch of fancy tools that you're going to have to go out and buy, and you're likely not going to have laying around your garage or workshop. So everything I'm going to use in these videos is stuff that you likely already have or you can get very inexpensively. As I said, these rings are marked on the top. In this case, they have a small circle on the top of that ring, that second ring. That always faces up towards the top of the piston. Same thing, you roll it around and then you pull out on the end and very carefully pull it down to that second ring groove and it'll drop in. Try not to scratch up the side of the piston while you're doing that, because those rings are pretty sharp on the edges. Top ring's the same way. Notice I'm just using, in this case, the blue bag is the second ring, the red bag is the top ring, and the yellow bag was the oil control rings. Same way, we're just rolling it on there and being careful not to scrape the sides. Now that they're all on, we need to clock those rings so that the gaps are not lined up. On the oil retention rings, you want them at least 45 degrees apart on the top scraper ring and the bottom scraper ring. They need to be at least 45 degrees apart. They don't have to be 180 or whatever. You can use 90, you can use about anything you want, but they have to be at least 45 degrees apart. These rings are going to move around as the engine runs anyway, but especially for break-in, because these are chrome rings, it's pretty important to get the clock, the spacing right on the ring end gaps. On the second ring and the top ring, you want them as far away from each other as possible. The second ring, you have to be careful that it's not right over one of the bottom oil scraper ring gaps. I'm using a ring compressor here. I didn't have one, so I ran to the local tool store, and this thing was $4.50. I normally use it's a lot fancier kind of ring compression device. But as I said, I want to use things that you can get easily or already have. So this is one of the band style ring compressors. This was, like I said, it's $4.50 at my local Steve's Wholesale Tools. We oiled the rings down good. Again, that's just Marvel Mystery Oil in that can. So you can use regular engine oil. Don't use grease. You can use regular engine oil, or even transmission fluid. I've seen people use transmission fluid. I like Marvel Mystery Oil. It works for a lot of stuff. We're going to tighten down that band clamp. You don't have to get real crazy with tightening it. You'll know it when it gets tight. I mean, if you try to get it too tight, you're going to hurt the band. You just want it real snug. You'll know it when you get there, and it's likely not going to be lined up very well on the tops. So you can either wait until you put the rod assembly down into the cylinder to straighten it up, or you can do it while it's out like this. Just take anything flat and you can tap it down and level out the edges of that band. It's a one-piece band, but it overlaps itself, and one part will be higher than the rest of it, and it's easy to tap it down. Now we're going to take the rod cap off, make sure the rod nuts stay in a safe place, and we're going to put some simple fuel line, 3/8 fuel line, or 5/16 fuel line, whatever. You can use surgical tubing. You just want something to protect the crankshaft. You want something to go over those rod bolts to protect your crankshaft. You've gone this far being nice and careful, so you don't want anything to start up. You're just going to screw on, and they don't have to cover all of the threads. They work as a standoff. As long as there's something on there, it'll keep it away from the crankshaft. Be sure not to forget to put your rod bearings in. There's a tab on one side of the bearing, and there's a tab on one side of the rod. They'll only go in one way. Make sure it's down there nice and even. Then you're going to lube it up. Don't want anything going in here dry. You can use, while you're assembling an engine, other things besides an assembly lube. I used to use STP a lot. It works just fine. Some of the Lucas products work well. The assembly lube is available about anywhere. A tube lasts for many engines, and I've just gotten kind of used to using it. Okay, now we're going to put it down in there. Each piston that you use will either have a notch or an arrow pointing towards the front of the motor. Be sure you put the piston in with that mark pointing towards the front of the motor. It's very important. When the machine shop put these things, the rod on the pistons for you, that's the way they're aligned. Now we're just using I'm using a piece of hickory. I've used it for years. Just gently tapping things down in there. And we're down. Once that ring compressor pops off, it's in. The rings are down, you're done. Now you just got to get underneath. Put your rod bearing in the lower part of the cap, lube it, put it on. You guide this thing down. See, it's pretty easy. You just push it down with your fingers to get it guided onto the crankshaft. You want the throw of the crankshaft at its bottommost stroke. That way you can get to the rod bolts easily. So you can put the cap on and the rod nuts and do all your torquing and not have to worry about doing any gyrations or contortions trying to get to everything. So each time you put a piston in, you're going to rotate the crank so that that throw for that cylinder is at its bottommost stroke. Make sure your cap's nice and clean. No junk or trash in there. Put the other half of the bearing in. Just like that. Only goes in one way. And on the rod bearings, there is no top and bottom like there are on the main bearings. Either shell will go in either half. Slap a little assembly lube on there. It's over on the bench beside me. And when you're putting these caps on, there's on the rod and on the cap, there's a number stamped on both of them. Those numbers have to go on the same side. In other words, the top part, the rod part for this cylinder will have its number stamped on it, and the rod cap will have that same number stamped on it. Those numbers need to go top to bottom, right on top of each other. So the number stamping is on the same side. If you turn them around, you're going to have a lot of trouble. It's going to lock the engine. It's not going to last long. You're going to spin a bearing, and it causes all kinds of trouble. So just be sure that the rod number, the stamping, is on the same side on both the rod and the cap when you put these on before you start tightening things up. Now we're just putting the rod nuts on. We're going to tighten them up by hand. And then just use a 13mm socket to get them tightened up. And the way that I do these, so that I'm sure I don't ever forget anything, is I don't torque them as I put them in. I tighten them down with a ratchet, and after the last one is done, then I go back and torque all of them one at a time. That way I've found from bitter experience that I don't forget to torque one of the rods down. Hand rotating the crank. It's going to get harder and harder to do the more pistons you have in there. In fact, after you get the second cylinder filled, it's probably going to take some kind of a tool to help you turn the engine over each time. I use a chain wrench on the crank snout. There are all kinds of different tools available for that slide over the crank snout if it's got the Woodruff key still in it. I've found that a chain wrench causes no damage. It's simple to use. They're cheap to buy, and they're available about anywhere. A nylon strap wrench works just as well. Anything that you can put on there, I wouldn't use vice grips or nothing that'll damage the nose of that crank. Anything that doesn't get terribly tight, it doesn't take a lot. Anything that doesn't get terribly tight will be fine. You can also just use the crank bolt. You can run the crank bolt in there and use a socket to turn it. Okay, in an attempt to try to keep these things a little shorter, I've just showed you doing one of the piston and rod assemblies. The rest go in the same way. Just take your time. Be careful while you're sticking that rod down in there and driving the piston down. Make sure that the crankshaft is down at the bottommost of its stroke on that throw for that cylinder, and you'll come out just fine. Next we'll do the heads, then the fuel rails. I've got a lot of video that I've got to edit and do narration. I had a death in the family, so it's taken a little longer than I wanted to, but I just haven't had the heart to do this stuff. Until next time, have fun, drive safe, and I'll see you guys later.